On November 1st, 1955, at 7:03 p.m. local time, a United Airlines Douglas DC-6 Flight 629, dubbed Mainliner Denver, was blown up by a dynamite bomb placed in the checked luggage of an unsuspecting passenger over Weld County, Colorado, while the airplane was en route from Denver to Seattle, Washington. All 39 passengers and 5 crew members on board were killed in the explosion and crash. But from the title and thumbnail, you already know that. However, what you don't know yet is the twisted and winding road of evil that led to the tragic conclusion on that November night in 1955. And this is that unbelievable true story. In August of 1938, single mother Daisy Graham left her 6-year-old son Jack Gilbert Graham in the care of an orphanage in Denver, Colorado. Daisy separated from Jack's father William long before his death from pneumonia the year before, and she had been struggling to support her 15-year-old daughter Helen and her own terminally ill mother, as well as the young 5-year-old Jack. But Daisy's estranged husband's sudden death had now left Jack fatherless, so Daisy was unable to financially care for all three, her daughter, mother, and young Jack. So Daisy made a fateful decision that would come back to haunt her years later. Daisy decided to abandon her youngest child, Jack, to the care of an orphanage, the Clayton College for Boys. However, the school had one condition. The orphanage told Daisy that the orphanage only serves boys who are needy, and if her circumstances were to change, she will be expected to tell the school, at which time they would return Jack to his mother. And so young Jack would call the orphanage home for the next 5 years. But in early 1943, now an 11-year-old Jack befriended a young girl working as a housekeeper near the orphanage. After showing Jack where her bosses hid the key to the family home, Jack used that key to steal a total of $2.15, about $40 today's money, on 2 separate visits. Well, soon the school superintendent sent a letter to Daisy, who was by then married to a wealthy man, John Earl King, and living on King's Ranch in Tapanes, Colorado. In a long letter, Daisy's gaze paused upon one of the paragraphs that was obviously the final straw, which read, "This is the 3rd time Jack got caught breaking and entering. It appears that instead of things getting better with Jack, they're getting worse." The superintendent added that Jack had run away from the institution several times. So in March of 1943, Jack was given a dishonorable discharge from the school. On his very extensive school file they handed to his mother upon his release, it read, "Constantly in trouble, discharged to mother." So Daisy immediately sent Jack to live with relatives. However, when he turned 16, Jack hit the road and joined the Coast Guard using forged ID papers. A year later, he was discharged as a minor after having been AWOL for 43 days. So in 1951, now 19, Jack returned to Colorado, where he promptly embarked on a life of crime. Jack forged and cashed 45 bad checks while working at the Timty Brothers Automobile Company and promptly skipped town, becoming one of Denver's most wanted men that year. He bought a convertible, drove it around the country ducking warrants for theft and forgery. Finally, in Lubbock, Texas, police tried to pull Jack over for a traffic stop, which led them on a wild car chase, crashing through a roadblock and finally crashing into a ditch. He surrendered only after officers opened fire and shot up his beat-up convertible. In the car, police found cases of bootleg whiskey and contraband he'd been smuggling into a dry Texas county and a .44 caliber handgun. Jack spent 66 days in a Texas jail before being extradited to Colorado, where he pleaded guilty to forgery charges. At his sentencing, his mother Daisy repaid some of the stolen money to Jack's employer and asked the judge to go easy on her son. But a probation officer's report described Jack as showing very little concern over the offense and said Daisy was overprotective of her son. Still, Jack caught a break and was put on probation. And while on probation, somehow and astonishingly, Jack was cleared to work for the Atomic Energy Commission. Soon, Jack made restitution payments and met the woman he would marry. By December 1953, Jack, his wife Gloria, and their two small children had moved into a house in Grand Junction, Colorado, which he had bought with a down payment from none other than Jack's loving mother, Daisy. However, Daisy's only condition was that she have a room of her own she could use when visiting. Then, sadly, within months, Daisy became a widow for the second time. But it wasn't all bad, because she inherited a fortune. Now financially stable and hoping perhaps to help make amends with her troubled son, she proposed opening a drive-through restaurant that Jack could manage. He agreed. However, it wasn't long before Jack found a new, less legitimate way to make money. So, Jack being Jack, early one morning spring in 1955, Jack purposely abandoned his new Chevrolet pickup truck on the train tracks outside of Denver, and on cue, a freight train plowed through the vehicle, destroying it, but netting Jack several $1,000s in insurance money. And it was at that point that Jack found his true calling in life, and, well, suddenly Jack became a one-man crime wave. In September of 1955, a suspicious gas explosion destroyed part of Daisy's newly opened Crown A restaurant, where Jack was working as manager. The insurance company determined the explosion was suspicious, of course, but never could prove it, so Jack filed an insurance claim which paid out. However, while Daisy thought that by showering Jack with money, jobs, and opportunity, she'd be able to repair the damage Jack suffered by being exiled to an orphanage while he had to watch the rest of his family live happily ever after, well, Daisy was sorely mistaken, because just 1 month after Jack collected insurance on the fire, as Daisy prepared for a trip to Anchorage, Alaska to visit her daughter Helen, Jack hatched a new plan. His most ambitious, evil, and deadly plan yet. A plan that would remove from his life 2 things that he believed were keeping him down: a lack of money and his mother. Sadly and ironically, his mother was the only source of income, but like I said, Jack had an emotional score to settle. Apparently, it was much easier in the 1950s to walk to the corner store and buy bomb-making supplies, because before his mother's trip to Alaska, Jack headed down to the basement, where he assembled 25 sticks of dynamite, a timing device, an ever 86-volt hot-shot battery, and 2 blasting caps into a compact time bomb. He wrapped the bomb up, packed it inside Daisy's heavy Samsonite suitcase, and loaded the case into the trunk of her '55 Chevrolet sedan. Then Jack and Gloria drove Daisy to the airport. It was November 1st, 1955. After saying goodbye to Daisy at the gate, Jack and Gloria, his wife, stopped for a snack at the airport coffee shop. Oh, and Jack made one more purchase at the airport. Jack bought an insurance policy on Daisy's life from a vending machine at the terminal. If you're old enough to remember, life insurance airport vending machines were a common airport fixture from the 50s up until the 1970s, because unlike today, plane crashes were fairly common up until the 1990s. But sadly, Jack's murderous plan was executed perfectly. The plane, the Douglas DC-6B, piloted by World War II veteran Lee Hall, exploded in midair minutes after liftoff, creating a nightmarish fireball in the open night sky. A witness described the burning wreckage of the plane as looking like an atomic bomb. All 44 people on board United Flight 629, including Daisy, were killed. It was the first ever act of sabotage against a commercial airliner in the United States. Bodies and wreckage were strewn and blown into small, indecipherable pieces everywhere as fires burned into the freezing night. Within hours, first responders began the grim task of determining what had brought down United Flight 629. They launched an investigation that at the time was unprecedented in scale, which would soon reveal a horrific and unthinkable crime for the safe and idyllic 1950s America. But with the help of the FBI and aviation experts, they collected as much of the plane and wreckage as they could and painstakingly reconstructed the destroyed Douglas DC-6 in a massive warehouse. Within days, investigators were confident it was an unprecedented act of sabotage and it was a bomb that had brought down the plane. Hundreds of FBI agents fanned out to interview anyone connected to the passengers killed in the bombing, trying to determine the target. By analyzing fragments of debris from the crash, investigators identified the pieces of luggage closest to the initial explosion. Eventually, based on the near total obliteration of her Samsonite suitcase, they settled on the likeliest target. That was the suitcase of Jack's loving mother, Daisy King. After interviewing both Jack and his wife Gloria, the FBI's suspicions focused on Jack almost immediately. They executed a search warrant at his home, netting a wealth of evidence, and Jack was arrested on charges of sabotage, following what I'm sure was a very hands-on interrogation back in the day. Jack signed a confession, admitting to planting the bomb that killed Daisy and 43 others on board Flight 629. But to ensure that Jack would face the death penalty for his heinous crimes, prosecutors dropped the sabotage charges and charged him with a single charge of murder in the death of Daisy King, a crime for which they were confident they could obtain a conviction. Jack attempted to plead insanity but was quickly found legally sane and competent to stand trial. Days after the decision, Jack was found slumped over in his cell after attempting to remove himself from the situation, so to speak, so he was placed on a 24-hour watch in the psychiatric ward. After the insanity offense was abandoned by his attorneys, Jack was sent back to the Denver County Jail to await trial. Jack Graham's trial in April of 1956 was the first ever televised in the United States after news organizations challenged the new law recently passed by the Colorado Supreme Court forbidding courtroom photography of any kind. Their challenge succeeded, and a judge denied Jack's request that television cameras be banned from the courtroom. A special booth was built at the back of the courtroom to house the camera equipment. On the first day of the trial, hundreds of onlookers crammed into the court's hallways and outside the building. People even brought lunches for the nightmarish picnic event. So Jack's evil deed was aired from coast to coast long before O.J. and his white Bronco chase. But Jack was a monster entirely without remorse. When asked in interviews with police and psychiatrists about the innocent people he had killed, Jack shrugged and said there could have been thousands dead as a result of his actions. He simply didn't care. During the prosecutor's closing argument, Jack's half-sister Helen then left the courtroom, went to a coffee shop, and got drunk. When police found her and asked her what she was doing, she answered, "If you just found out your brother killed your mother, you'd get drunk too." She refused the offer to take a ride home from the sympathetic police officers and demanded to be taken to jail. But Jack's sister Helen wrote a letter to the Denver Post saying, "What Jack did seems too horrible to be true. But I can't hate him," she said, "but he's guilty, so I want him to die." As for what kind of mother Daisy was to her children, her daughter wrote that, yeah, she made mistakes, but she tried. She was hard to get along with and temperamental, but I still loved our mom. But as for Jack, Helen said, Jack was a mama's boy. She loved him the best. She loved me too, but he was her special pride. She did everything for him she could. Too much, maybe, she added. But as for her brother Jack, now convicted and sitting on death row, she said, there is hell in the back of those dark eyes. After turning in her letter to the Denver Post, Helen got in her car and drove the 3,300 miles back to Alaska. The jury deliberated for 69 minutes before declaring Jack guilty of first-degree murder. They recommended a sentence of death. Jack's attorneys filed a motion for a new trial, which was quickly dismissed. They then filed an appeal to the Supreme Court of Colorado, introducing the new expert opinion that Jack had been traumatized by his years at Clayton College. In his only direct address to the court, Jack protested his attorneys' futile attempts to save his life, saying they had filed the motions and appeal without his permission to do so. Jack said he wanted to die. So on January 11, 1957, he was led into the gas chamber, strapped to a chair, and in front of a small audience at 8:08 p.m. Jack Gilbert Graham, son, brother, father, orphan, husband, murderer, was pronounced dead.